Hello, welcome to our Sterling Armory Sword Talk. This is episode 4302, and today we have a great episode. This isn't the first episode of 2023, but this is the first one we're recording in 2023. And we have a jam-packed January and February for Sterling Armory. So we're going to start on a roll here. And topic of today leads right into our first big event of the year, which is the Phoenix Cutting Competition. And we'll have two sword talks this week, which is new for us. And the first one is with the special guest that we'll meet in a moment. And so it's looking to be a good start of the year. And if you're at Phoenix Cutting Competition, make sure to come by, see our booth, and get to watch myself and a lot of other people compete in cutting. So it should be exciting. Okay, so let's bring everybody on. Alrighty, guys. We also have a special guest we'll bring on in a moment. But Josh, Colton, you want to give a quick intro?
Hi, I'm Josh Warbear, and you can find me at Warbear_Armory on Instagram and Joshua Von Warbear on Facebook.
And I am Colton from Copperthorn Customs. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, all the things, and then also on the Sterling Armory Facebook page and Instagram.
And did I intro myself? I don't even know.
I don't remember. I don't think so.
I'm Chris, again with Sterling Armory, and you can find us all on the Sterling Armory Facebook page and here on the YouTube page, obviously, if you're watching this. And I'm actually now hearing that clicking. Are you guys hearing that?
Totally.
Oh, just
that stopped.
No,
okay.
I'm not.
Dramatic pause effect. Okay.
Yes.
So now for our special guest. So coming to us from Phoenix. Yay!
Brittany!
Hi.
So, Brittany, you want to give a quick introduction?
Yeah, so I'm Brittany Saint Leafy. I am the head instructor and co-founder of Mordhau Historical Combat in Mesa, Arizona. I am also the co-organizer of the Valley of the Sun cutting tournaments, which we're hosting here in about a week.
Which is awesome. And so if you're watching our channel, you probably are already subscribed to her channel. So actually, I didn't... when we were talking at Combat Con, I think like before COVID, I didn't put two and two together that I had watched your videos for quite a while.
Oh, really?
I was like, oh, wait a minute, that's her. So I was a little embarrassed by that. But I didn't realize. But yeah, because you've been doing videos for a while, right? On your channel?
Yeah. I've been on the sword internet for a few years, and It's sort of funny. I have a lot of people now that are like, oh, hey, I think I recognize you. You look kind of familiar. And I'm like, did we meet at a tournament a few years ago? And they're like, no, I totally follow you on Instagram. I was like, oh, hi.
Yeah. So yeah, it's been interesting, a lot of fun. Seeing all the videos. So Brittany does sword reviews. She does HEMA gear reviews. That's actually where I got a lot of my HEMA jacket info from one of your reviews. I can't remember which one it was.
Oh, yay.
And then actually the sword talk's blocking it, but I have my sparring gloves and my HEMA stuff up there.
Nice.
So before we jump into the main topic, what are we all drinking? So Josh, you want to start? Or do you have something?
Yes, I would like to start. I have nothing to drink. I am very thirsty. I have a project I have to leave and go to in a bit here, so I figured the worst thing I could do is get drunk and then go do that.
That's a
fair enough.
I'm gonna just drink.
There you go.
I've got Sahara metallic gold paint.
I got.
I will be sampling.
So I just got back from my holiday trip in Scotland, and so I brought back more of my Stag's Breath, which I think is the best drink in the world. It's a whiskey mead mix, and you can, as far as I can tell, you can only get it there. I haven't found it anywhere else. So yeah, cheers. So I'm drinking for both of us, Josh.
Awesome.
Ben, what do you got?
I've just got a Blue Moon because I never know what I'm gonna have. I always just open the pantry right before, like 5 minutes before, and I'm like, I guess that's it. So Blue Moon today.
Perfect. Awesome.
Nice.
And I know we were surprised with Brittany a couple minutes ago saying, hey, do you have a drink? So, did you find anything?
I have water.
Yay.
I was like, what do I do? So I was like, I have water.
Yeah, there you go. Hey, it goes down a bit easier than whiskey. So our main topic of today is, in a couple sword talks ago, I think 2 or 3 ago, we talked about going into topic of cutting and saving it for a different video. And definitely wanted to save it to get some expert cutters on, and we have one today, which is great.
Oh, thank you.
And then Wednesday we'll have Phil as well, Phil Martin, who's your tournament runner. Is that the right way to say it?
Yes. Yeah, Phil and I were running that tournament together. So
Awesome.
Yeah. I guess real quick. So I come from. I know we talked a little bit at Combat Con, but I come from like a Chinese, or not like. I come from a Chinese martial art background, and so I did lots of cutting in the Chinese arts, and I also dabbled in some Japanese cutting arts. And then I've been watching the HEMA, not just the practice of cutting in HEMA, but the tournaments and how they're doing it very different in other arts. Watching it kind of blossom and come up. And I guess it'd be a good conversation to kind of get a gauge of where you think it is now, like in terms of cutting now and how it kind of relates to HEMA in terms of, you have your sparring side and then you have your cutting side. And, do you see people that compete in both, or is it usually pick one or the other? And then
that is a huge question.
It is. Yeah, no,
that's like a whole video in and of itself is like each part of that.
Right. So lots to talk about.
Yeah, that's a lot. Where to start? I think the best place to start is sort of like where cutting kind of started within the HEMA community, because it's relatively new compared to the rest of the practice within the community. It wasn't really super popular 10 years ago, even. Like it's still fairly new. And a lot of the cutting originally many years ago was sort of a little bit of frog DNA with some of the Japanese sword arts.
I noticed that a lot.
Yeah, and there's a reason for that. So North America, specifically the United States, was sort of the forerunner for cutting within the HEMA community. That's not to say that people in, Europe or Oceania weren't doing cutting. They were, but in terms of it being like competitive and being integral and holistic to, HEMA in general, it was sort of spearheaded by a group of Americans. The most notable was Mike Edelson, and his background is the Japanese sword arts as well. So because of his strong influence on the HEMA cutting community and the Japanese sword arts influence on him, that kind of was where things started. So there is still some almost, I don't want to say frog DNA because that sounds almost disrespectful to the work that Mike did, but we're trying to revive and recreate an art that was dead, right? So the only thing we can really do is try to look at other arts that have a lineage. And so HEMA's cutting sort of developed out of that largely because of Mike Edelson's work and the students of his.
Yeah, and I'm assuming that's why our tatami is the preferred targets and
that's a big reason as to why we use something like tatami, for example, as opposed to being like, let's just do pool noodle cutting. Like I have very strong opinions on pool noodles, so I'm not even sure I want to get into that.
Oh really? Okay, so we'll get that for the end.
Yeah, I think that's the worst cutting medium that anybody could possibly use to train on, but that's my very personal opinion. No
worries.
I think out of context, I think someone just randomly saying, I have a strong opinion on pool noodles is the weirdest thing I've ever heard spoken
You
out
can
loud.
quote me on that. You can quote that.
We got it.
Yeah.
That'll be the quote of the video at the bottom.
Yeah.
Strong. Awesome. So so what I find interesting is, so I've seen, like I kind of lived through the resurgence of cutting in the Chinese arts. And so now I'm kind of seeing it in the Western arts, and a lot of the similar arguments are coming up that I saw. So the Chinese arts went through it. Oh, we lost.
Sorry.
Okay.
I'm back.
So the Chinese arts went through it in the late 90s, early 2000s. And it's at a really good point now, I think. But a lot of the arguments I'm seeing from people in HEMA are like, I'm like, man, I've seen that argument before.
It's a funny thing in the community right now because I think
some people are like, cutting isn't important. Some people are like, you have to cut.
I'm gonna try and not put myself in a pot of hot water. I'm going to try my very best to not make any hot takes here.
Right. You can leave that to us.
But
yeah.
So I obviously have a bias, right? Like I'm super into cutting. It's a huge part of my practice. I'm a competitive cutter who now has retired from fighting and exclusively does cutting. So I will admit that bias, but I've always had a holistic approach to my martial arts. When I started HEMA, and I kind of recognized early on that it was not as well developed as other martial arts. There was a lot of pieces missing. I kind of sought that out in other places. I took up catch wrestling. I took up jiu-jitsu. I wanted to try and make sure I had a sound understanding and foundation to the art that I was studying. Because obviously, when as we recreate it, we kind of miss some pieces. So with cutting, I look at that as a way to approach sword arts holistically. So when people tell me like, "Oh, cutting is kind of useless. Cutting is kind of stupid. There's really no reason for you to be doing it other than like to do fancy tricks." That really just says to me like, okay, so you suck at cutting and you've never really done it. But to be fair, like there are parts of the HEMA community where cutting isn't necessarily valid or useful for them. Like folks that do something like small sword, for example, they're not any less valid because they don't cut. It's just that it's not really within the system that they're studying, right? There's no cuts in small sword as far as I know. I'm also not a small sword person. I don't know.
There's not. I mean, you'd be slashing tatami, right? You wouldn't be cutting it, right?
Right. Yeah. So like there is definitely aspects to the HEMA community where cutting isn't really super useful to them. But I think if you're coming from it from a perspective of like doing Blossfechten, you're trying to recreate a martial art or like the sportive side of it. You're trying to recreate duels, for example, or you want to understand the mechanics of a sword. Like that's where it becomes holistic. That's where cutting becomes very useful. So I try not to be too exclusionary about it, but if you're hitting people with swords and you've never cut, it's maybe a good idea to try it.
Yeah, so that's exactly that's what happened in the Chinese arts. And so back when I was coming up through the Chinese arts in the late 90s and very, very early, like 2000, 2002-ish, like I thought I knew how to use the Chinese broadsword because I've done forms and sparred with them for years.
Yep.
And then I got a hold of Scott Rodell, who's kind of I would say Scott's probably the forefather of modern Chinese swordsmanship, at least here in the U.S., probably worldwide. And he's like, "Have you ever cut anything?" And I was like, "No. Why would I? It's easy. Why would I need to do that?" He's like, "Oh, you don't know anything."
It's
very much the same. That's how I got started. Like Chad tried to teach me how, and I was like, "I've played baseball before. I know how to cut something." And that's the wrong approach. I was like, "Oh, I'm just an idiot. Damn it!"
So I brought Scott down for a seminar, and man, it was eye opening. Not only did we learn that our cutting, like we couldn't do it. Like I tried to cut even a water bottle and did it poorly.
I think that's what the HEMA community struggles with, right? Is like having to confront the possibility that you might not actually know how to cut when you're an instructor for a school, right? You're a multiple medalist in fighting, and if you can't cut, you don't want to be confronted with that possibility. And when you look at the HEMA community, because it kind of the way it grew up, there's a lot of people who are instructors that never had formal training in any other martial art. They started 10 years ago as a dude wanted to do stuff in the park and doesn't have formal coaching, doesn't have formal sports psychology background. Like there's nothing like that for a lot of instructors. And so they've worked very hard to be accepted and be validated in the community and find value. But, it's very hard to admit that you can't do something that seems to be pretty integral to sword fighting in general, right? So I try not to be too mean about it, but I struggle when there are some big names in the community who kind of scoff at what I do, and it's like, you can't do it, but you're one of the top fighters in the country.
So what we found and I noticed this, so I started taking some Japanese sword arts as well, and I had these conversations on their side with some really high-end instructors who do, Tameshigiri and Tiana Ryu and stuff, and that's all they do is cut. And I had these conversations with them, like, there's always a concern that when you start doing cutting only, that it can turn into a sport, right? Where the cutting starts getting separated from the art.
That's a very real possibility, you know.
So I think that's probably what they're trying to poke at, but they're not.
Mhm.
It's like it seems like it's an all or nothing thing when it's not, right? So you
Yeah,
can still cut
that's
and still relate it to what you're doing, right?
for sure. That's kind of why I try to go about it from the term holistic is why I like it. Is because like if you only do cutting and you've never done any fighting or sparring and you've never tested that side of it, you might be missing a foundation. And I didn't realize this at first when I had talked to a few JSA instructors as well, because I was fascinated by it, right? I talked to Sensei Rich Class, who's a really well-known guy over here in Arizona. Awesome. He's been super helpful to me. If he ends up watching this, then I'll be super yay. But he was telling me, like, when you're doing cutting, you step first, you plant, you find your foundation, and then you throw your cut. But if you do that in sparring, you're going to die, right? Like, you're going to get hit. You're going to get absolutely just gacked. So, you know, if you only do one without the other, you're absolutely missing an integral part, especially if you're trying to be a holistic martial artist. But if you're realistic about your goals and you're like, I have no interest in ever having to worry about sparring, I just want to know how to cut, then that's okay. Just be honest with, you know, with your intentions and with your goals.
Yeah. So again, same thing there. So what
I
actually pointed out that same.
I see you doing the poke. Are you?
You're
just
talking
like
about me.
outing yourself right now?
Yeah, totally. I have no martial arts background in anything. I've done like no.
He's just a really good sword maker.
I love making swords, and like recently have just started cutting some things, and I am horrid at it. So it's like.
I love
this conversation is awesome to me because I'm just like soaking it all in, and I'm just like explaining it to me like I'm 5.
Yeah,
I'm the Michael Scott.
I'm only small amount ahead of you, Colton, where I'm like I've cut and I've sword fought a few times and used to do Renaissance fairs and fought like people with balloons on their heads with rapiers, and that was fun. But as far as professional going, it's like, man, I've made a ton of swords and I've not used a ton of them.
Like, you guys are
that's
talking
an interesting
and it's
concept.
just like going right over. I'm like, this is awesome, and I hope I can learn a lot from this. So keep going. But I'm
I love
like,
that. I have
no
humility,
martial arts background.
Yeah. So for Brittany, we're all just sword makers, right? But we all have so I grew up in the martial arts as well. And then Josh, you did a little bit of martial arts, didn't you?
A little bit, yeah. Not a ton. It was like poor redneck martial arts where I'd check out a book from the library and read it for like 6 months straight and go, that will probably work one day when I have to use it. And then when you're like 6'1" in high school and, 200 pounds, no one ever messes with you. So, and when you're a nice person, you usually avoid conflict anyway. So it's
I'm
obsessively learning martial arts. Never fight. But not a lot.
Yeah, going back to that point, Brittany, I actually had that same conversation in the Chinese arts. So about stepping and cutting versus stepping and sparring, and I actually it's the other way around. So because when I was teaching, so after I did a lot of work with not a lot, I did some seminars with Scott Rodell, and he kind of showed us, kind of kicked us off into starting our own thing. And when we did that, people would always ask, like, well, hey, why am I stepping before I cut when I'm fighting? I can't do that. And I was like, well, here's the difference. When you're learning how to cut for the first time with a sharp sword, take baby steps, right?
Yeah, the less movement, the better.
Yeah, exactly. And the better you get at it, then you'll start making it more like you're sparring with. And I think a lot of people just see it without realizing it's it's a training implement itself, right? It's an evolution.
I think that's what. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I think that's one of the things that the community as a whole sort of forgets when it is critical of cutting, is that because cutting is still in its infancy, the majority of competitors outside of your very top tier, high level, always meddling cutting people, I was going to say cuddlingists or something, but I realized that was not where I was going with that. Cutting medalists, the majority of cutting competitors are still just in their infancy compared to something like, Jimishigiri. You have people who are like, yeah, I've been cutting for like 3 years. and they're like kind of mid-level in HEMA, right? But then that's white belt stuff in other martial arts,
right,
you
yeah,
know?
exactly.
So when people talk about it critically in the community and they're like, oh, well, you know, cutting has these weird, you know, differences and it's not like sparring. It's because like the majority of the cutting community hasn't had time to get past that early stage to start desportifying their cutting or blending their cutting and their sparring in a way that actually makes sense holistically. I'm going to keep saying that. That's my buzzword, holistic.
Okay, that's the way to say it.
Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to say, because you said desportified, I think that's a great word. And I think, doesn't somebody have a seminar at the tournament that's called desportifying? Oh, did we lose
I was
Josh?
thinking we had lost Josh. He paused there for a minute.
Oh,
and judging by the time, he's probably not coming back. So
true, yeah. Oh, he might have got kicked out. But yeah, there's someone doing a seminar.
A seminar,
right?
yeah.
Yeah, I hope I can. So I'll probably be at the booth, the Sterling Armory booth, or I'll be competing. But if not, I hope to get to that because that was a big thing in the Chinese world. So we would always point back to fencing, saying like, look at fencing compared to the art that it came from, and how very different they are now. We want to try to avoid that, right? And because that's just not the intent of the art. So on that note, though, so I guess two big topics. One is, and we'll start. We'll just do one at a time, so we're not throwing out such a big thing to talk about like I did at the beginning. So one is, what do we think, or what are your thoughts on the intent of cutting in HEMA? And then two will be related to, types of blades used for cutting in HEMA. But that's a big topic we'll get to a little later.
That's a fun one.
Right. So going back to that one there, so what are your thoughts on the purposes of cutting in HEMA, and then how? One thing I was a little confused at, especially at CombatCon when I was competing, was I had no idea how I was being judged, and I'll probably ask Phil that same question because he's, I think, or are you judging as well?
For Valley of the Sun?
Yeah.
I'm judging some of it, but I'm also wearing the organizer hat so much because it's in my own studio.
Right, yeah, I wasn't sure if you were going to have time to.
Yeah, I think I'm stepping out for a few of them, and Kyle Griswold will be judging some of it, so I'm going to be floating in and out.
So I'm assuming the judging and points are geared towards the intent of cutting and what you're supposed to be doing with that.
So, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, so if you could help. So I wasn't quite sure. I was a little confused by the judging because I actually didn't think I did as well as I did at CombatCon. I was like, why am I this?
No, you definitely did.
So yeah, I mean, it was awesome, but I didn't expect it. So I thought a lot of folks there did very well, and especially in that first round, I didn't think I did any better than anybody else. But I even went to Phil. I was like, hey, I think there's a mistake in the scoring. He's like, no, there's not. And I was like, okay.
Yeah. So I'll kind of start off by saying, if you want to get into the kind of nitty gritty of the rule set for Valley of the Sun, that is absolutely a better thing for Phil. He's the one who designed the rules, and he has all of the scoring criteria. So I can't really speak to that more than just like, it's his baby.
Would you say that? Yeah. So would you say that every tournament has been very different?
Yes.
So far?
Yeah. Cutting rules are different, and it kind of depends on who's running it. And that's also changed over time as well. So fortunately, we're seeing a little bit of consistent. Unfortunately.
One of the
where do I want to go with that comment?
Yeah, you can go either way.
Yeah, fortunately, in one sense, fortunately, Phil is actually running more than one cutting tournament in the West Coast, which is a good thing. Yeah. Unfortunately, sometimes you can get such different rule sets that it can be a little bit confusing for like just the wider HEMA community. Like, how is judging going to work for cutting? It can be variable. So if you have somebody who's consistently running multiple tournaments like Phil, he's doing CombatCon, and I think he's doing part of SoCal Sword Fight. But, sometimes it doesn't always work that way. You get other people who are like, I want to run a cutting tournament, but I want to judge it based on what I think is valuable.
Yeah.
And that's still valid, but it's just, sometimes you can get some weird curveballs in there.
Yeah. And I think that's where HEMA is very different than Japanese and Chinese arts right now. Because when you go into either of those, especially Japanese, you know what they're looking for. It's you know the moves. You're gonna have to do Rokanangiri. You're gonna have to do a couple of, I can't, now I'm blanking on names right now. So, but you know the cut patterns ahead of time.
Yeah.
Unless you're very, very, very advanced.
That is not a thing for HEMA.
Right.
Because we don't even have like katas, right? Like,
right.
It's just not something that's really well developed in that sense.
Yeah.
But for cutting, from a safety perspective, they will release the feats in advance. So you will know ahead of time what your cutting expectations are. And that's mostly, except for the advanced
so I'm like,
cutting.
what am I doing? I don't know.
Yeah, that's an intentional thing. But for beginners cutting, intermediate cutting, they release those feats in advance. One, obviously, so that you can prepare and cut as best you can, but also from a safety perspective, you don't want people who are not very well prepared trying a feat that they've never done before, and then they just yeet a sword into the crowd or something, right? Because they're not prepared. So yeah, they will at least give you some kind of idea of what's going on in the tournament ahead of time. So, yeah.
So like one of the things that I did like a little better in the Chinese arts versus the Japanese arts, and not saying Japanese arts doesn't have it, they might. I just never got to. I haven't done a lot of Japanese arts, but in the Chinese arts we would take actual techniques. So the intent is very different in the Chinese arts cutting than it is in the Japanese, from my experience and what I've personally done. Whereas the Japanese arts are focused on angle of cut. They don't care about how fast you do it. They care about precision. And so angle of cut and technique, stance, form, everything is highly critical.
Yes.
On the Chinese arts, it's the angle of the cut isn't really important. But can you do a cut that, like say you have a technique where you have to do a block into a P-cut, like it's just a quick block and a quick cut. Can you actually do that and cut a tatami mat? And your angle isn't quite as important. It's can you do the move?
That's really interesting because it's funny that those two separate things, I can kind of see how both have sort of developed in HEMA. So as I had said before, Mike Edelson being part of the JSA community very early on, kind of spearheading cutting, he was based on the West Coast, I think in New York. And he ran most of the cutting tournaments on the East Coast, I think like Long Point, for example, and a couple other ones. And his rule set was very strictly based on the angle, the motion, the form. And he was very nitpicky about that, much to a lot of people's like displeasure. Yeah, especially for like HEMA kids, right? Where it's like
you're just not used to that, right? That's not how you train.
Well, that and like everybody argues about how you do his Verkow still. So, you know, how do you decide like for a cutting tournament to do exactly right? So, that early sense for cutting tournaments was very much based on the form and the angle and very, very precise. Now you're starting to see a shift where it's like, we'll kind of judge the angle, but it's like, can you cut through the mat, but can you do it with this very specific action? So I'm going to Helsinki in a couple of weeks to compete in a cutting tournament, and it's being run by Sean Franklin, who's an American. Well, actually, he's not an American. Oh my God,
he's Canadian, right?
He's Canadian like me.
Yeah, sorry, Sean, we didn't say it.
I mean, he's based.
I'll try to edit that out. I'll put Canadian over here.
Yeah, he's based. It's funny, like we
we
were in Vancouver together. You'd think I would remember.
He's from the North American continent, so you weren't.
Yes, North American. It's kind of funny that he, being based in the United States, ends up having to go all the way to Helsinki to run a cutting tournament. He's also run the swordfish cutting tournament before, I think. That's neither here nor there. But
he has a lot of great. So he has the Sword Science Facebook page, right?
Yeah, Sword STEM, and then Sword Stuff is another one. He's a busy dude.
Interesting.
So yeah, we're going out to Helsinki. I'm gonna go compete. He has had a heavy hand in developing cutting tournaments on the West Coast initially, and then now that he's in Michigan, he's kind of implementing that over there. But that's definitely a little bit different. There's a feat where they're like expecting you to stand there. They're going to throw like a dowel at you, some big stick, and you have to parry it with the sword and then cut back through the mat dynamically.
Okay,
So
that's very much like the
that's
Chinese stuff.
exactly. I thought that was kind of interesting that HEMA in just a few short years has gone from one to the other.
Right. Yeah, and I'm wondering. So that's where, like, in terms of the intent, right? So when someone starts HEMA and they're new to everything, like, and then I think they like understanding the intent of sparring. I think is pretty easy to see, right? Because you're trying to practice the moves that you're learning, but understanding the intent of cutting, people may not understand that, and so I was trying to. I guess that's why I kind of threw the question out of is what do we think the overall intent is? Like in the Chinese arts, the intent was to ensure that you can actually cut with the moves that you're trying to do.
Yeah.
So, like I saw there somebody posted like cutting is like board breaking. I don't know if I would say that. So
I have to admit, at first I saw that and I got my
depends on
feathers
how
a
you
little ruffled. I was like, excuse me. But I actually had to step back and reflect on that a little bit because I understood that as like, in the United States, a lot of people, well, anybody who's kind of familiar with martial arts at all, looks at board breaking as sort of like McDojo stuff if you're not really like super into it, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so I read it because he did it in a meme format. So I was like, dude, what the heck?
Yeah.
Like it seemed really condescending and I took that personally because I was like, dude, my whole personality is cutting. Like, excuse you.
I know. There's good ways to board break and then there's bad ways.
Right. Which and my response to that wasn't really like super fair. Obviously I internalized that and projected. But as I thought about it,
you did, so don't worry.
Yeah, I think a few people might have. But I kind of had to really think about it. And I was like, for its intent, it is very similar, right? Like you're board breaking in order to kind of test the form of your strikes.
Assuming you're doing board breaking right.
Right. Yeah, we're assuming that.
Yeah.
But that's the same thing with cutting, right? Is like, you can cut.
Have you seen some of our cutting videos? You'll see.
Yeah, no. Hey,
no,
that's me. Because literally, I'm just like, we put a pineapple up, maybe a pumpkin, and we're just like, chop. That was awesome. Like, so you're talking about me here. Oh, I'm loving it.
Yeah, like if you're doing it to kind of like have fun and like enjoy cutting, like, then that's fine.
Did you see the Arms and Armor cutting video contest?
That was awesome. If you haven't, you should go watch.
If you haven't seen it, you should watch it.
I have to now.
For the Arms and Armor cutting video.
I will.
So yeah, like I hopefully am not completely derailing this, but like from my perspective of just like, I haven't really done much cutting at all. Just cut some fruit, some water bottles. I've never tried cutting a mat. However, like what maybe would you suggest for me? Because like I'm getting a lot more interested in this, and so it's progressing for me. And so it's just like I love making the swords. I've been making stuff for a long time. I had no idea, and so actually handling the sword and cutting stuff with it has progressed my making of the sword to be more functional, actually like usable in the hands of somebody who knows what they're doing. Whereas I don't. So it's like, how am I want to keep learning how to use them, and it will improve my sword making. And I don't know if you have any input on that at all, but like, where would you start with cutting? Like, what's your? Let's throw that into
Chad
this conversation.
So that's I would say.
I was saying this, I'm like, why am I not going to Chad's freaking classes? I don't know. Like, oh, that's on me. I need to go.
Chad, Brittany, right?
I don't know Chad. Chad Healy?
Chad Healy.
Oh, yes, I love Chad Healy.
So Chad Healy lives in Provo, and I'm in Springville, and that's just two little cities in Utah. So we're right next to each other.
Right.
And I'm like, as I was saying this, where do I start? I start with Chad. Like that was that was a bonehead question on my end.
Yeah. So prior to Combat Con this year, or not this year, last year, we went over to Chad's and just he had a few mats to cut, and we were testing out some blades that we made, and we were just having fun. I think, was that your first time cutting?
That was my first cutting ever.
Yeah.
Like, never
Yay.
done it, and it was
Yeah.
awesome. And I'm just like, I love it. Me and Josh have been cutting up fruits and bottles and stuff every other week or something. Yeah, I mean, they've been fun, but like, we need to get Chad over there with us so we could be like, you idiots, dude, come on.
Yeah,
make a good cut.
I can't even imagine him being like that.
Oh no,
mean.
he never would.
No, he's not.
Never would.
Yeah, he's the sweetest, kindest human being I've ever known. Like,
is he going to be at Phoenix?
No, he has family.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Things.
Yes, he does, yeah.
Which is exciting, but that's not for me to say. Yeah. So yeah, he's busy. Yeah. He's very busy with exciting things.
Yeah.
But yeah, funny story. Chad is like, he was kind of a dark horse, sort of like you, Chris. Kind of came into the HEMA cutting scene and just tore it up, blew it right out of the water. And I was competing against him, and my gosh, I was like, oh man, I suck.
Really good.
He killed it. And I was like, and he was so humble about it. And we talked so much about it after, and he was like, it just inspired me to just be better, I guess. Just like, not obviously like as a cutter, but just like my mindset for competition is like, it's fine. Like, it's a journey, and he was just so cool about it. So I have nothing but kind words about Chad.
He's awesome. I am derailing the conversation a little bit, but so every time I go out there, we keep talking about I need to bring gear out there so we can spar and do stuff. And I went out there, I can't remember what time, but sometime probably November-ish last year, if not earlier. And we got a chance to spar, and it's fun to spar with somebody who's that good, because you're just like, wow, I'm so terrible. Because he's sitting there just barely moving, and it's like, whoop, gotcha. I'm like, son of a.
Yeah, he's a very, very technical fencer. He is exceptional.
It's a lot of fun. So I'm excited to do more with that. But jumping back to the topic. So I guess, where do you see, like, do you foresee, like, almost like, I don't want to say a governing body, but do you foresee like an overarching theme for cutting in HEMA going forward, where the tournament's going to start aligning a little bit, or no? Okay. So one of the things that's difficult from a maker's point of view, and I've had this conversation more so with sparring blades than cutting blades, because cutting blades so far, people seem to like a lot of different types.
Yeah.
But for sparring blades, they're very like, some tournaments require a certain flex. Some tournaments require certain, roll tips versus flare tips. Yep. Everything's different. And it's like, if the HEMA community could just come together, pick a type of a head or a type of a tip, pick an amount of flex, and go with it. That would be so much easier on the maker. So.
Oh, I totally agree. It's funny that you bring that up, because I'm actually... I was talking to one of my friends who is trying to prototype a fetish foot right now, and he presented it to me. I'm not going to say who it is yet, because it's still kind of a secret squirrel mission. Yeah. But he showed it to me, and I was like, "Oh, dude, this isn't going to pass any tournament spec." And he was like, "There's tournament specs?"
Yeah.
And I was like, "No."
Kind of. Depending on the tournament.
Depends on the tournament. But he really had to kind of change everything that he made. Unfortunately, he had to change the tip, he had to change the width and everything. And, it's unfortunate, because as a maker, you're trying to create something for the community, and it's very hard when, you put all your effort into something and the community looks at it and goes, no.
Yeah.
Like, like, that's very frustrating. And I worked with Krieger Armory up in...
yeah, we love those guys. Sean and...
They were in Ohio. They're in Indiana now. Yeah. Sean. I was working with Sean very early on when he was prototyping his first fetters. And, we went back and forth a number of times. And I was like, you got to change this. You got to change that. You got to fix this. You got to fix that. And he was, thankfully, he was super open to that feedback. And, the humility that comes with being a vendor and being able to listen to the feedback of the community is super big, because I've seen a number of vendors who were like, no, screw you, this is my product, and then went nowhere and floundered, and you never hear about them, you know.
Yeah.
So yeah, we worked together a lot and tried to get that first fetter made just right, and now I think they're one of the largest producers of fetters in the country.
He can't keep stock. I was like, dude, you gotta hire people.
I know. I keep telling him that. I was like, dude, how's the new hire process going? And he's like, I'm so busy. I was like, good problems.
Yeah, he and I were actually talking just the other day. When I was actually still on vacation. But we're hoping to have him on a Sword Talk as well, because we tag up all the time at Combat Con and stuff, and you know, they're awesome. So
yeah, he's great. He's great. So yeah, it's a very difficult thing, being a maker, trying to get it right and understand what the community needs. And the only kind of thing I could really speak to on that is pick a region that you want to serve and look at the tournament requirements based on the biggest tournaments in that region. Right. Build to those specs. Right. And it is, but you know, if you can get, this is sort of the funny thing about the HEMA community is like, it's very grassroots, kind of no gods, no masters, right? But man, we love our mob mentality, dude. Like we're all about that. So if you can find one big tournament like Combat Con, for example, or SoCal Sword Fight, or one of the really large ones in the country, like, you know, I'd say 150 plus people that attend, the big ones. And you can go to their specs, their requirements, you get them to approve that fetter. From there, they will sort of cascade, and other smaller events will be like, oh, so SoCal lets that sword work, so they've probably already vetted it. It's already on the approved list, and it moves right along.
Yeah.
But you know, like anything, it needs a huge amount of R&D before it can be put out, because I mean, people's lives are on the line otherwise, right? So, but yeah, it's very difficult because nobody can agree on anything, right? So,
especially, I mean, a lot of my early, so I don't do fetters. That's the one thing I try to stay away from, because so many people make them. And, you know, Sean specializes in those, so I don't want to step on his feet. I don't want to compete with Regnier or any of those guys. But when I was doing the most requests that we get, because almost all of our stuff is custom one-of-a-kind pieces. And one of the most requested sparring items that I say is they want a sparring sword that matches their cutting sword. And so I came up with I don't know if you saw any of the ones I had at Combat Con or at I forgot the name of the other one. The Salt Lake City. Actually, I don't think
Salt Lake Open.
Yeah. Oh yeah, SLO. Yep.
So I kind of came up with those for that, and a lot of that was based on feedback from. So I had a lot of customers in Spain and then Italy early on. Like this was probably 6-7 years ago, and I made some for them. And initially they wanted a very flat tip that was spatulated out, and I was like, "Are you sure you want that? Because that doesn't seem too safe." And they're like, no, we want that. And then they got it, and they're like, oh, maybe we don't want this. So we went back and forth, and then I kind of used it ever since then. But I think sparring blades is a much more difficult thing to wrap around. Colton, what were you going to say?
I had just a question about cutting blades, because you have all these regulations for sparring blades.
I was about to go there.
Yeah, like what would be regulations for cutting blades? Like, because I know you'll do cutting with an arming sword, but it's like what are there like length limits, weight limits? Like, is anything like that out there? I don't know.
So it depends on the tournament. Yeah, it depends on the tournament. When you register for a cutting tournament, you kind of know what you're getting into. It's either a longsword cutting tournament or an arming sword cutting tournament or anything single hand cutting tournament, and they will tell you what is allowed and what isn't.
Okay.
But there's always the risk that someone's going to show up with $100 fantasy sword, you know. So you'll see it in the rules. It'll be like it has to be historical. It can't be some Franken sword hybrid. It needs to actually match like an oakshot typology, or an oakshot type, not an oakshot typology. Look at me being smart. Anyway, so there's that, and then just like other kind of like the fetter issues, it needs to be from a reputable source. So if you show up with a homemade sword, which some people do, It's it needs to be vetted by the head of the cutting tournament, and they will kind of spec it out and be like, you know what, this doesn't look super safe. It looks like it's completely welded together. What are you doing? Or they'll look at it and say, you know what, this looks like it meets all the things that I would expect from a cutting sword, and you're good to go. You use it at your own risk. So that's a tough one too, right? Like there's no specs, unfortunately.
So I'm looking at my little green 18 single-hander back there, and so the blade is actually from Chris. So it's like a more or less well, okay, not more or less. It's a historical 18 single-hander, but it's got a very fantasy hilt on it. Does hilt really come into any of that, or is it kind of just you're like, I don't know, like that's just kind of a point in case because it's halfway fantasy, halfway historical.
It really does depend. I mean, some tournaments are very strict about it being like it has to be a historical sword. It has to be, you know, really rigid in its requirements. Others have a little bit more leeway.
Interesting.
As long as it's, you know, European and two-handed, or it is you're going into a longsword tournament, but it can't be longer than this or shorter than that. So most cutting tournaments are good about presenting that information ahead of time, and they'll spec, you know, or they'll look at whatever you bring and make sure it's kind of like within their guidelines. But
like, have you seen anyone go into a longsword competition with like a Albion Maximilian or anything like that?
Yes.
Were they allowed to do it or no?
Yes, and then it was never allowed again.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that. Yeah. Well, then you have to give them just quick multiple cuts, right? Because there's no way they're going to do that. So.
Well, you know, and that, I don't know if you even want to get into that, but I was going to say, there's also optimized swords and at what level you want to start, you know.
Yeah, so actually I did want to jump into that because that's one of the big issues that pulls cutting into a sport, right? In a way, it sportifies it instead of desportifying it, which I think is what the goal is. And so, like in the Japanese arts, there was even one of the instructors I was talking to told me like they would have different cutting feats, right? And so one feat you have to do like a really quick, you have to do 4 consecutive cuts and as quickly as you can. It has to be under 2 seconds or faster. And then you have to go immediately over and then cut through 4 mats at once.
Would they switch swords?
Well, that's the thing is some people were switching swords and then they were like, no, you got to use the same sword. Like, you can't switch swords in the middle of that. That's ridiculous. Like,
I just had that conversation with Phil a couple days ago because I was like, can I switch swords? Can I use my 16A.4 for this and my 18B.15 for this? Like, and he was like, Brittany, come on, you know the answer to that.
In the Chinese arts, what we did is obviously this only works if you do sparring and cutting. But what we would do is if you're doing both, which I think everyone at our time did both. I think we were required to. But your sparring sword and your cutting sword had to be as close as possible. Like if your cutting sword was really wide and very short, but your sparring sword is very long and very narrow, that wasn't going to fly. If you're going to fight, you got to, whatever you're cutting with has to match your cutting or your fighting sword. And so that was a pretty neat way to deal with that, I think. I'm not sure if anyone's ever thought about that on the HEMA side, but again, you'd have to do both.
Absolutely. It has been a hot topic in the cutting community for a couple of years where for a few years it was the optimized cutter was the Albion Principe or the Albion Alexandria. And it was kind of believed that was like a cheater sword. I don't believe that. I think that's bullshit.
No, I mean, if you have to do like multiple cuts in a row, you ain't doing that with one of those. It's too heavy. Right? So.
I've also seen advanced cutters with a Principe lose to an advanced cutter who was using a cold steel hand and a half. So it's not a magic sword. It's not a cheater sword. You can screw up just like everybody else with the same sword, you know. So, but there was a point in time where that was considered like the pinnacle of cutting swords.
So if you're only doing single cuts, then I would agree with that.
Yeah, it's great. But that's where the HEMA community was. People were like, okay, I need a Principe to be competitive. And you know, obviously people were like, okay, well that makes cutting inaccessible for a large portion of people because Principes are very expensive. They're not easy to get a hold of because they're expensive and they take a long time to get unless you buy them secondhand. So people were very grumpy about that, and I totally understand that. And they were like, well, you shouldn't be using a sword like that anyway because you don't fence with that sword.
Right. I don't think I've ever seen a sparring version of a Prince.
Well, that's where the argument kind of breaks down, because like on one hand, I completely agree. For a really long time, I had a sword that was really long like my fetter and very narrow. And so I could move it like I moved my fetter, except the problem is that my fetter is only, what, 1.5 inches wide?
Right.
And, you know, like...
Yeah, you can't really compare them to fetters, right? It's a whole different thing.
Right. So if we're talking about, the swords that you fight with, the swords that you spar with, well, I don't think many people want to allow non-fetters into into fighting tournaments. If you're going to be like, okay, well, I'm going to cut with a Type 18C, how do you make that safe for sparring and fighting tournaments, right?
Right. Yeah.
Right. So the alternative to that is to ban Type 18C swords from cutting tournaments. Well, I don't know. I don't agree with that. I think people kind of just want to complain about something that they're not really super involved in. Because the only time I've really seen that be heavily argued is by some very loud people in the community who don't do a whole lot of cutting. But you know, I respect that. I totally agree. Like if you fight one way and you cut another, that kind of goes back to the initial thing we talked about, where it's like, where are you in your skill level? Are you able to actually start blending those two, or are you doing two different things?
Right.
I'm at the point where I finally switched my competition sword to something completely like polar opposite to what I fence with.
Yours was very long at combat. I was like, it's longer than mine.
Yeah, I was using...
Mine's a 36-inch blade.
Yeah, mine was huge. Mine is a Type 16A.4 from Angus Trim. It's very thin, very narrow, but it's super long. Right. Which I really liked, but it had its drawbacks for me because I'm only 5'6" and 105 pounds on a good day after dinner. So, you know, so I decided, you know, if I wanted to be competitive in cutting, and this is the sportive side of cutting, obviously, if I wanted to be competitive in cutting, I needed to change my sword. So I switched over to a Type 18B. Yeah, 18B.15 from Angus Trim.
Yeah, and my personal one is an 18B for my own.
Yeah, so I lost about 5 inches in length, but gained about 3 inches in width. So, and it's nothing like my fencing sword at all, but I can definitely move it better than I could the longer sword, and move it more similarly to how my fetter moves, because the point of balance was actually closer to my fetter than my 16A.4 was to my fetter.
Right, yeah. So, and that's the other tough part with fetters, right? Is we intentionally pull the balance points back so they don't hit hard. But you don't want to do that with a cutting blade.
Yeah, I think that's something that a lot of people forget, is that fetters have been designed to basically, and I hope I don't offend anybody saying this, but like fetters are kind of like a purposefully castrated sword. Right? So like when we talk about like, oh, you have to cut like you fence, well, cutting is inherently lethal. Sparring is inherently not.
I think the idea is the movements of it, right? Making sure you're not, like, you know, we've said a couple times, like make sure you're not sportifying one or the other, you know.
Right. And I'll be totally honest, it might be controversial, as much as I try to say, oh yeah, I do holistic sword stuff. I'm okay with sportifying cutting. I actually really enjoy the sportive aspect of cutting. I really like it as a competition. I like it as its own thing. But I'm also perfectly comfortable kind of like keeping one foot in each camp. But if it did go a completely sportive direction, I don't think I'd be unhappy. I don't think that I would, you know, lose any more enjoyment to it, because I really am liking the competitive side of it. So
the one, I guess the big difference in Western compared to, well, I mean, I was going to say compared to Chinese and Japanese. Definitely compared to Japanese, but Chinese maybe not so much. But in the Japanese sword world, you can get wider blades that cut easier. So their intent there is that they don't want it to be a competition about blades. They wanted it to be a competition about the person cutting.
which is that's another thing in HEMA that has become a hot topic, is
So,
everybody gets to show up with whatever sword they want.
right. So in the Western arts, though, because there's such a variety of blades compared to Japanese arts,
right,
that it's hard. So I had a conversation with a couple of guys. I want to say it was what's the group up in? Is it Blood and Iron up in Canada?
Maybe Canada. Canada's a very large country.
The one that Sean, I think, came from? Was it Blood and Iron? I can't remember the name, but and this was Combat Con 2017, I think. Sure. Was maybe like if people are using 18Cs, maybe that should be its own division. 18C division, 18B division, but then you have all these divisions, and you maybe have 2 people in each division, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we are splitting apart. So in the Chinese arts, we did split Dao, John, so straight sword, 2 different types of Daos, 2-handed Dao and single-hand Dao. Those are all separated. And I think, so right now, Western arts, or HEMA, is separating longsword, which longsword itself is a very broad definition, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Arming sword is separated out. Do you ever foresee a falchion or falchion messer category? Because I would love to do that.
Probably. I think the only thing that's kind of lacking in that is, one, there are not a lot of folks who actually do that, like even sparring wise. It's sort of a smaller part of the community. Not to say that there's, not part of the community. It is. It's just it's not nearly as prevalent as longsword. You are starting to see arming sword becoming sort of the second cutting tournament that's being offered. It's happening at SoCal Sword Fight, and obviously we're doing that at Valley of the Sun.
Yeah, I'm excited for that. It was kind of part of Combat Con, kind of.
It's sort of. It was kind of integrated into just like cutting generally, but it wasn't split into its own category.
Did I tell you I wasn't prepared for that, by the way? I didn't know I had to use the arming sword, so I ran back to the booth, and the arming sword I used, that one, which I'll use again in Phoenix, I just grabbed it off the table. It wasn't my personal blade, but it was one I had made to sell, and I was like, well, shoot, I need an arming sword. So
might as well see how it does, yeah.
Yeah, it did quite well, yeah.
Yeah, I think, on one hand, it can be like, cutting is like golf. You, as the competitor, can choose what works best for you, and that works on the platform of equity. When you talk about standardizing the sword, so when I go to Helsinki in a few weeks, I'm actually not able to cut with my own sword. They are providing it to standardize.
Yeah,
so they're looking...
I've heard some tournaments do that.
Yeah, they're looking at it from the platform of equality as opposed to equity. So,
but is it?
But is it, right? And that's the thing.
Whoever cuts first
has the sharper edge.
If they roll their cut bad, that messes it up for everybody else.
Yep, there's that. I mean, that's less likely. My concern, and I say concern sort of loosely, because I'm actually really excited to cut with a sword I've never cut with before against people I've never competed against. Like, I'm actually really excited for this challenge. But, looking at it from the sportive side and looking at it like, oh, this is trying to standardize for everybody. Well, that's great. I'm 5'6" and 105 pounds. I'm going to have trouble moving an Albion Earl, which is a huge sword compared to... Yes.
Oh, wow.
So it's a big sword. It's heavy. It's really long.
That's and 13, isn't it? Or is
I think so. I couldn't tell you. I don't even remember. I've only seen the sword like a couple of times, but
have you been able to practice with one? I've been following a lot of your stuff, but I have
a story about that. Let me get there. So I kind of looked at it like, okay, standardizing it, everybody's going to use the same sword with the same sharpness, everything is the same, and that's great, but I can only move a sword so fast, right? I can only put so much speed, so much power behind it. Whereas, let's say a person who's 6'1", 250, that sword isn't going to be nearly as heavy to them as it is to me. So there's that. That's something to consider, in terms of like equality versus equity. I go up to a cutting tournament and we're using 26-inch stands, I think, and the tatami mat stands above my head.
Right.
So I'm reaching for my cuts when most people are just looking down on it and cutting, So there are things where I like the opportunity to be able to optimize my cutting sword from a sporting perspective, because it does give me what I think is the best chance to be on an equal playing field with other people. But,
so are they combining? And maybe this is a sensitive topic. I'm not sure if it is. I'm tone deaf to it, and apologies ahead of time.
No, you're good. You're good.
Are they combining girls and guys like they did at Combat Con? Because that actually surprised me. Because in the Chinese and Japanese arts, they don't do that.
So, yes, most cutting tournaments, I would say almost all cutting tournaments in HEMA are open. They are not divided between any gender. There were women's cutting tournaments at one point, and
It's not big enough. Or although I can't see that because I think there's more women than guys. That at least in my experience. In well, not Combat Con. Combat Con was almost all guys, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Over on this coast, there's a lot of women cutting on this coast. So
yeah, I'm sort of an outlier in terms of being very competitive. I have medaled or been in finals for most cutting tournaments I've entered.
Yeah, I mean, you could have won Combat Con. I mean, I think it was kind of a luck thing at the end there between who was going to get first. So
no, I definitely was not. I was not as well prepared for that as you guys were. But that's fine. Like,
no. John, I thought John was going to get first when he got that final. I'm losing the name of it, but he barely clipped right over the peg, and I was like, "Oh, that's it. It's first."
Yeah, it's for HEMA, the topic of having gendered tournaments has always been kind of a hot topic.
Okay.
Yeah, if you haven't been in the HEMA community for more than 3 years, you probably wouldn't know. But
no. So yeah, in the Chinese and Japanese, they keep them separate. And
right, yeah, I think as cutting grows, and if there is a reasonable demand for it, it might happen. But I don't see it happening for a really long time. Like
we had, I don't know if it does. No.
And that's the tough thing. That's where it starts kind of getting into the weeds. Is like you can always make the argument about like, well, the average woman is smaller than the average man. And
it is a strength thing to a degree, but depends.
It is right, but I think if your approach to it is we want to get more women into cutting, it can be very intimidating for a woman to go just cut in an open.
True.
We don't see, for a long time we didn't see a lot of women. I was like one of the only women doing it for a really long time. Not the only one, but one of the few.
Have you done? You said you did a little bit of Japanese sword arts, or no?
No, not formally. I went and did like a class once.
Yeah, that's especially the cutting. At least, so here in Minnesota are the only groups that I know of, and they're dominated by women. So it's pretty cool.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. I would love to see more women doing cutting in HEMA. But again, I think there's been some factors, some history in the cutting side of HEMA that has sort of deterred that a little bit. Do I want to get into it? I think I do.
You don't need to come to a hot topic.
No, it's something I'm very passionate about. I feel very strongly about. So I think I can kind of tackle it without getting myself in trouble. But for a long time, when HEMA started again back in the day, this is before me, even before I started cutting. HEMA cutting tournaments were invitation only, so you couldn't just enter a cutting tournament if you wanted to. You had to be invited. Yeah, and at least on the West Coast, anyway. I don't know what it was like on the East Coast, but on the West Coast, it was invitation only, and it was all men. Just that's just sort of the nature of early martial arts communities. Is they're just by their nature sort of dominated by men. So of course they only invited the top fencers, the top people, and it was invitational for many years, and you weren't allowed to cut unless you'd been invited. Which kind of turned it into like an elitist boys club for a really long time. And then I wanted to cut.
Yeah.
So
cut,
yeah, so it kind of came up as like a topic, and there was a little bit of a placation of, well, we'll create a women's tournament. And it was sort of like, well, if you don't compete in the women's tournament, you're basically going to ruin it for every other woman. And if we don't have one, then we'll just cancel it. And I was like, oh, okay,
Yeah,
cool.
weird.
I guess I have to now. So I didn't do very well because I didn't know what I was doing. But I felt like I had this burden because I was like the last person to register. They're like, if you don't do it, we don't have enough and we're going to cancel it. And I was like, okay. So I jumped into it. I didn't know what I was doing. And,
in the Chinese arts growing up in tournaments and both sparring, sparring forms, all sorts of things. What we would always do is, like, say there was only either one girl or one guy, but the other division is a lot more. Or like there is an age, so usually we did it in age groups too. Like say there's someone from the 12 to 16 who there's only 2 people there, but in the next up there's like 18 people. We would just blend them together and nobody cared. Everybody liked it. So
yeah.
And you don't want somebody not competing because there's not enough people there, right? So
yeah, it was it just when it happened and it was like we're creating this women's tournament, it kind of just felt very, very placatey and kind of like, look at this novelty, and that's not how I wanted to cut. I didn't want to be
doing the same as everybody else. Right.
Yeah. And then I'd been asked at one point, like, well, so what's the solution here? What do we do to get more women into cutting? And I was like, well, normalize it. Just make it visible. It doesn't have to be a women's tournament, but have women just going out and teaching. And then suddenly they was asking me to teach, and I was like, oh, shit, not me. Like, I didn't mean me. But so just making it more normal and less like weird, because I still kind of get like people being like, oh wow, you're like the only woman who's medaled in these open tournaments and cutting. And
is that true?
Sort of.
Okay. Well, congrats.
I say sort of because I was not the first woman to medal in a cutting tournament. I was the first woman to medal in a open intermediate cutting tournament. So Nicole Smith from Blood and Iron was the first woman to win an open cutting medal in beginners cutting.
Well, and that's just US, right? Because we're not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like,
because there's saber cutting tournaments over in Europe going on all the time. So.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I'm talking specifically about longsword, HEMA, the cutting tournaments that are kind of within the known HEMA community specifically. So I guess technically on record, she's the first to win she was a bronze medal in beginner's longsword. And then I think after that, I don't think she really competed in cutting.
There was a HEMA tournament in Orlando. This would have been 2017, 2018. And then one of the female instructors from the JSA school was there. And she's like, hey, can I compete? They're like, yeah, sure. And she took gold. It's like, no problem.
I didn't know that. Who is that? Who is this sword queen? And how do I be friends with her?
Yeah, Sherry's awesome. So Sherry and Mike Fumal run Nihon Zashi out of Clearwater, Florida. And I think that's the only...
I need the connection.
Yeah,
the sword queen needs to be in my life.
Yeah. So I think they're retiring though from teaching but they ran Nihon Zashi longest time. I think one of their students has taken it. I'm not entirely sure. This is how it seems.
Well, then I completely walk back everything I just said, because as far as I knew, I didn't know of anybody, and that's amazing. That's so cool.
Yeah, I don't know if that would have put her on any of the HEMA scorecard or anything like that, because
cutting's not on HEMA scorecard. So
I thought it was.
No, I've wanted it to be forever.
Weren't we following it on iComeback? Or is that just a live?
So it'll be on HEMA. Oh, you mean HEMA scorecard? Sorry, I misinterpreted that as HEMA ratings. I was like, there's no cutting ratings. Yeah, it's on HEMA scorecard. But if it was a tournament in, you said Orlando?
I think it was Orlando. I'll have to double check with that. But yeah.
Maybe if they use the software.
Maybe earlier than that.
I can try and find it.
Would have been an early. So John Knock would know.
I will ask him.
I'm actually going to see him tomorrow, hopefully, because we got a bunch of tatami here to practice for Valley of the Sun.
So that's awesome.
Tomorrow. Although I have no idea what to practice, so I'm just going to practice everything.
Yeah. Wow. Well, yeah, like I said, I completely walk all of that back now that it's on record. I take it all back, And
I wasn't trying to. I wasn't trying to do anything like that.
I just didn't know, because like for the longest time, people would come to me and be like, "Oh, you're the only one I know of. You're the only person that I know that did this." And I was like, "I guess that's true, I suppose."
I also don't know if it was an open. It could have been a ladies, girls, guys tournament. I'm not sure, but I do know she took gold because she's like, yeah. I mean, I kind of had an advantage because I came in as a nobody knew I was, an instructor in the Japanese arts, but the rest. So she had trouble with some of the, and I'm paraphrasing because we had this conversation over a year ago. I think she had trouble doing like, some of the German cuts that they just don't do.
Like false edge stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Other than that, she took gold. So I thought that was cool. Again,
That's so cool.
It might have been women only. I think. I don't know. I'll check.
I would love to know, because like I think that's just the coolest thing. Because like, I don't want to be the only one. It kind of stresses me out.
So Mike Fimal runs. He's Sensei Fimal, and that guy can cut anything with anything. So
that's so cool.
He's I mean, Phil's a machine, right? Phil Martin's a machine. I have to say Mike would I'm trying to say this so that I'm not putting down Phil at all. But Sensei Fimal he's cut his entire life, right? I mean, he's amazing. He can cut anything with anything, and I've never seen anybody cut as good as that guy can cut. And his wife is not far behind. And
that's goals. That's goals, man. That's where I want to be.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. So I guess we're just over the hour here. I guess closing up, from a not just a practitioner, but also in a competitor, but also from a tournament runner, I guess where would you like to see HEMA in general go in terms of cutting?
Oh gosh, I think what I'd like to see is having tatami be less expensive. So, I think I would like cutting to be more accessible. There's a perception that it's very inaccessible because of the cost associated with it, and just the lack of instructors in it. There's not a lot of people who are actually qualified to teach it. And I don't mean that in like a gatekeepy way, but it's like it's a little bit different, right, than just sparring and figuring it out as you go. There's a little bit more to it. So I would really like to grow cutting and promote it in a way that gets a lot more people involved. I would really like to see cutting tournaments at every major event in the country. It's not there yet. I'd like it to be so that I can go everywhere and compete more. I want to do all the cutting tournaments. There's not enough of them.
Do you think tatami is the way to go? Because the Chinese arts have kind of gone away from it. They're using bamboo.
I've never cut bamboo.
It's I gotta be careful how I phrase this. It's not harder than tatami,
but it's different.
As soon as you go off angle, it becomes a lot harder than tatami.
Oh, interesting.
And tatami, right? Yeah. If you have your edge angle right and you have a good sharp blade, and as long as your angle is right, if you throw that blade, you can almost put, I can't say zero strength, but not much strength, and it will go through.
Yeah.
Bamboo, if you don't have the strength, it'll bounce right off. So it is a little different in that regard. So it does require a little extra oomph to get through it. But once you get through that initial oomph, it cuts just as easy as tatami does. It also depends on the bamboo. So the Chinese arts, we try to use the 2-inch, what they call green bamboo, fresh cut bamboo, and it's not bad. The nice thing is it grows everywhere. So
it's super easy to get. I would love to try cutting with bamboo. I've never done it, so I can't really say anything beyond that. But I think it would be. I really like tournaments that are starting to utilize tatami, because I think that's still like our best medium for HEMA, from my experience, obviously.
As long as you can get it. Right?
Yeah, but unfortunately, we'll see in the next.
It seems to be getting,
for 2023, we'll see if that changes.
It seems to be getting more available. So,
but we'll see. I think tournaments that have blended mediums. So SoCal Sword Fight is doing paper and tatami. I actually have really enjoyed paper cutting.
The big rolls, right?
Yes, it's easy from the sense of like you don't need a lot of force, but you have to continue your cut for the whole 24-inch arc. You can't, start cutting in an arc. It's very unforgiving. And it really throws off even the more seasoned cutters. They're kind of like, wait a minute, like you have to calibrate a little bit to it at first. So I like blended medium cutting tournaments, and this is probably the one thing that's going to get me in hot water. I really want to do those knife cutting tournaments where they like hack the wood and hack the rope. And I would love more stuff like that in HEMA, but it would do horrible, horrible damage to our very expensive swords.
Well, you'd have a different tool, right? Your sword would be, you'd have a differently built sword for that.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, I would love to do more stuff like that. I think that's so cool, and I might, if I can find it, transition over into that weird knife stuff.
Yeah,
I think it's cool.
I think that would give, so right now you don't see like type 15s or type 17s that are armor fighting blades, right?
Yeah,
big
not
spikes.
often.
You don't see those in cutting because they don't cut that well. But something like that, they probably would do quite well because they're stiffer, stronger blades. So.
Yeah, oh, for sure.
That would give a chance for that to shine. That'd be kind of neat. I like that idea.
Yeah, I love the idea of like more experimental cutting tournaments. I think there's obviously a place for the very traditional HEMA cutting tournaments that we've developed where you have your tatami feats, and it's like, can you do your basic 6 cuts? Can you, do this stuff? And I think that there's a place for that. I think that's awesome. I would love to see more experimental cutting. Like, here's a rope that's like weighted on the bottom, but we've got targets on the rope. Can you cut those targets on that rope? Yeah. Like, things like that I think would be really cool. Make it a little bit more fun to watch, because some people find cutting exceptionally boring to watch, and I think that's such a shame, because like I could sit there and watch, like, I still do it. I go back through YouTube videos, and I can't tell you how many times I've watched Long Point 2017 cutting finals in my life, probably like 20 times. Like I will go back and watch cutting all the time.
Is that the one where they had the moving tatami targets?
No, that was SoCal.
Oh, okay. So that's the one thing I was like, oh, I don't know if that's a good idea.
Well, that's why it's not really a thing anymore.
I was like, man, if someone just steps the wrong way and trips, that's going to be bad.
Yeah, that was some risky biscuits for sure.
Yeah, but it was entertaining to watch, because I watched that and I was like, oh man, you're just waiting for someone to fall.
Yep. Yeah, I would like to see cutting tournaments be really fun to watch from a spectator perspective as well.
Yeah, I thought maybe it's just me, but I thought, even though I was involved in it, so I might have some bias there, but the way they set up Comeback on last year, I thought was really fun to watch, because I stayed and watched the advanced cutting guys, and I thought it was fun. I don't know, maybe that's just me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm biased too. I think every cutting tournament is cool. I like watching like my students just cut overhows, and I'm like, ooh, yeah, like more cutting. So, but a lot of people don't find it interesting, and that's okay.
Before we jump off, I did want to ask, so why do you hate pool noodles?
Yeah, so I think they're just a terrible, stupid medium. They don't offer anything useful. People are going to be like, oh, what is she talking about? You need good edge alignment, good speed. Yeah, well, you need that for literally everything. Right. So
I was going to say, the only thing pool noodles tests is the sharpness of the sword. Right? Yeah. So if you have a sword that's slightly dull, it'll just knock the pool noodle over. But that's not the honestly, person, right? That's the sword.
Most people don't know how to sharpen a sword very well.
No,
so if anything, it's going to just serve a purpose of being extremely frustrating to cut. Right. It's not going to give you any feedback that's better than cutting paper, water bottle, tatami, like, other than the fact that it's extremely cheap sometimes. Like, if you get it at the right time of year, sometimes it's like $3 a pool noodle, and you're like, just cut bottles. Like, if you want to be wasteful with plastic, cut bottles. Like,
yeah, that used to be tatami, right? We used to be able to get mats for $3.
Yeah, it used to be very inexpensive. So yeah, I hate pool noodles, because they're stupid.
Gotcha.
And I hate them. They're like, you ever like see? They're usually at like used car lots, and like the dude. And every time I see one of those, I think of pool noodles, and I hate it. So. Yeah, you can't get me to.
Gonna see you driving on the road cutting those down.
Yes.
In the news today. Yeah.
I will never do a video cutting pool noodles, because I think it's so absolutely unhelpful and useless for people's training.
Yeah, I would agree with
There's
that.
my hot take.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. So as a maker, what we use them for is, for at least for me personally, is if I have one, I'll just say if it pops a pool noodle, the edge is pretty good. If I'm knocking that pool noodle over, I need to resharpen this blade.
Yeah.
That's not anything training for me. That's just seeing if the sword is sharp enough. So there's other ways to do that too.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the thing. Is like there's nothing that pool noodles offer that literally any other medium that's easily available could just do.
I did like clay. I'm not sure how well that'll go over, but I've seen a lot of people use that.
Yeah, I like clay sometimes. One, it's extremely messy. So you have to you have to do it outside.
Right.
And I don't like doing it with a sharp unless I'm okay with that sharp just getting gross. Like not only just dirty, but like the frequency with which you could possibly have grit in your clay, or like you cut a chunk, it falls on the ground, you put it back. Are you picking up stones? Are you going to damage your sword? So like, do it with a fetter, in my opinion, which is nice because then it's accessible from that sense. Everybody has a fetter, right? But then you have to.
When I cut clay with a fetter, it felt like cutting bamboo with a sword.
Yeah, it's cool. I think it's fun. I've done it a few times.
So if you want to get a feel for bamboo, that's what it feels like.
Oh well, then yeah. Like I enjoy clay cutting. It's kind of a pain in the butt because it's so messy, and you have to keep it like damp, and storing it is a pain in the butt.
Yeah, well, especially out there, right? Because you guys are very dry. Here in Florida, we have no problem. We could just keep it out all day. It's going to be moist.
Yeah, no, there's a time limit on clay here. So yeah, it's not my favorite medium. It's also just heavy. It's really heavy, and I'm a little baby, and it's heavy.
Yeah, I hear you. Well, thanks again for joining us, and I hope it's been fun for you. And I'm excited to get this one online, and excited for the tournament this weekend. I guess while we're waiting on Colton here to come back, anything you're excited, like especially excited for the tournament this weekend?
Oh yes, so much. I am really, really excited to have Angus Trim giving a workshop. He's kind of an elusive creature. He doesn't really get out from his region very often. Yeah, he's up in the Pacific Northwest, and so we don't really see him too frequently anymore. And for him to be coming out and giving a lecture workshop thing is really, really cool. And of course, like selfishly, I just like spending time with him.
He's one of the reasons why I make blades now. He was one of my, I saw what he did, and I was like, I want to do that.
Yeah, he's a legend. He's an absolute legend, and I was very, very honored when he agreed to come out and make the trip to see us and do this. So I'm really looking forward to that. And then selfishly, of course, it's 2 weeks before I leave for my tournament in Helsinki. So it's like the best opportunity I could possibly get to train with some of the best cutters in the entire world for what we do in HEMA. I get to train with Julian Schutze and RJ McKeon and Sean Franklin and Philip Martin and Jeremy Halliday, and you'll be there. And there's so many names that I'm like, help me get better in this short amount of time before I go to Europe and do this thing. So
that's gonna be fun.
Selfishly, I just gathered everybody there to train me, and that's it. So
perfect. Yeah. Well, those guys would help you a lot more than I will, I think. So
I don't know. I've got a lot I want to ask you. So
yeah, I'm excited one, I'm glad Arming Sword's separated out. That's going to be fun.
Yeah. I wish I could compete, but ethically, I will not compete in tournaments. Nope.
I was going to ask, and then I realized that it's probably obvious that you're not going to be competing because you're running a tournament. So yeah, and seeing Angus, I think he said this is his last event, right? So
yes, that is true.
Yeah, so we're excited to. So back in the Combat Con years prior to COVID, we would booth. He would be next to us, or at least right down the row, but I've talked to him online since the old Sword Forum days, and even before that. So, and he's bringing like 16, 17 blades. So.
Yeah, he's bringing a ton.
Yeah, Josh and I and Colton, we talked about it a little bit, but Josh and I were joking about how many are we going to walk home with. So
yeah,
it's going to be a mad rush to get those. So they're probably going to be gone. I'm guessing the first couple hours.
Yeah, Gus is very good at putting swords in people's hands. I know all about that. He's been integral to my whole cutting journey. Just like he's been very supportive of me and very much like, oh, I hear you're looking for a sword to cut with, and I'm like, yeah. He's like, well, here, try this. And I'm like, oh. He's like, it's yours now.
My trims are off camera, but I have long sword and
sword.
Actually, the Armory sword I won at Comeback on, which is surprising. But yeah, I've always been a fan of his. I've owned many of his blades throughout the years.
Yeah.
So, alrighty. Well, thanks again for joining. And I guess we'll do some quick outros. And I will, if you can send me all your info, so everyone watching, all of Brittany's info will be linked below. So you can find her channel. I guess anything you wanted to find. So it's up to you where you want to go. So you want to do a quick outro, and then we'll do Colton, and then I'll end it off.
Sure, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It was my absolute pleasure to be here and chat with you and talk about my favorite thing ever. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Hopefully you can come on. I mean, we do, our Sword Talk covers everything from movies to, making swords to using swords to all sorts of, Japanese, Chinese, Western, doesn't matter. We cover everything. So if you ever want to jump on, if you see a topic that you like, let us know. Or if there's a topic you want to talk about, let us know. And
oh, yeah. I would love to be a guest again in the future. I think that'd be great.
Thank you. Colton, you want to do a quick outro?
Yeah. I'm Colton from Copperthorn Customs. I like making swords and hopefully get better at cutting swords in the future. Because this topic has been very inspiring. I seriously, I just sat there and just like, this is awesome.
That's why I wanted you on this one.
Yeah, no. I'm just like, hey, this is great. I am gonna learn a lot, and I feel like I did. So I'm glad that we did this this topic, and I've been looking forward to it for a while. So
awesome.
This has been good. Yeah, you can find me on Sterling Armory page.
Yes. So yeah, Colton and myself, and then Josh, who was on earlier. You find us on Facebook, Sterling Armory. Then Colton also has Copperthorn Customs. And then Josh has Warbear Armory on Instagram. Is that right? Yeah, Instagram.
Yeah, Instagram and Facebook.
Facebook. And are you guys on TikTok now? Someone was on TikTok.
I'm on TikTok.
You're on TikTok. So one of the
I don't know what I'm doing.
You who got the 100,000 views?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Brittany dropped some TikTok videos and immediately got 100,000.
Oh, I bet.
Oh, yeah.
What are you up to now?
I have 100,000 followers, which isn't that much in the TikTok world, but I have like 9 videos.
Talking to us two here, that's a lot.
We have tens of followers.
Yeah, we have at least 10.
Yeah, it was weird. I think like I threw my stuff up on TikTok, and then like 9 of my videos ended up with over 1 million views and like 27 million reach. Like it was nuts. It was just.
I was like,
yeah, that's awesome.
Going. Yeah, you got to figure out how to. Can you monetize that at that point? I think
they won't let me.
No, why?
No.
TikTok hates violence.
Yes.
Can you say stage props? I don't know.
I've tried. It's very clear that what I'm doing is sharp, and I've gotten 3 of my videos removed for violations.
Couple removed.
Really?
They hate me. They hate my swords. So I monetize Instagram, so that's good.
Do you know Matt Easton at all?
Matt Easton? Yeah, I know Matt. I'm gonna see him in March.
He might know a way around that. He'd be the one to know.
He's not really on TikTok.
That I don't know.
Yeah, it's only TikTok that I have an issue with. Everything else I've managed to monetize. Like my Instagram does really well. Awesome. My YouTube, things like that. They're much more friendly to swords, but TikTok, for whatever reason, is like, that's violent and that's bad.
Yeah, I want to never go. I'm sure there's much more violent things on there.
There is.
Yeah. Well, thanks again for joining, and thanks again for everyone who's watched and stayed with us the whole time. And so this one's dropping Tuesday before the event, I keep calling it the Phoenix Cutting Tournament, but it's the Valley of the Sun.
Valley of the Sun.
Yeah, I don't know why I keep doing that. Valley of the Sun Cutting Tournament. And then we're going to have another one with Phil Martin so we're recording it Wednesday, but it will drop Thursday, hopefully. Excited for the tournament. And thanks again for joining. And thanks everybody for for joining in. You can tell I've had a little too much of my drink here. So Brittany, what I'll do is we'll do the outros, but then I'll bring everybody back on in a second.
Okay.
All All right. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Yep.